Welcome to the Backfire Introduction to Identity Providers webinar. This webinar is just an overview of what an identity provider is and where it fits within a federation and within the organisations that run them. So the first question is, what is an identity provider? So I found this definition on Wikipedia. It's basically an identity provider. It's got an abbreviation of just IDP. You'll hear people use IDP all over the place when it comes to identity federations. And it's just a system entity that creates, maintains, and manages identities, information for principals while providing authentication services to relying party applications within a federated or distributed network. An identity provider offers user authentication as a service. So it's just a piece of software, uses people's identity information, people's principals, it provides an authentication service, and it's there for relying parties. So we'll just have a look at each of those terms in a bit more detail. So a system entity, so an IDP is just some software that implements the identity provider part of the SAML or Security Access Markup Language, SAML version 2 standard for our federation that we're building at the moment. There are other protocols around, such as OpenID Connect, which is being talked about by other federations in a big way. Brooke mentioned that earlier about people talking about OpenID Connect as another federation protocol that people are looking at implementing or have implemented. But for the moment, we'll just concentrate just on SAML version 2. So SAML 2 has been approved by the OASIS Standard Committee way back in March in 2005. So it's been around for a long time. There are plenty of implementations available. If you're interested in having some sleepless nights and want some reading to get you off to sleep, all of the standards are defined and written down at the OASIS site. And there's a link there so you can go and troll through the standards. One thing we recommend you don't do is try and implement your own IDP from the standards. Use somebody else's implementation. There are plenty out there. Trying to build something from scratch will just be wasting your time, and everybody else is trying to get it working. So use somebody else's implementation. So the system entity, as I said, it's just a piece of software that implements the standard. The identity information, this is information that we collect about individuals that are affiliated with an organisation. In some cases, this will be personally identifiable information. It can include unique identifiers for your users or the users that are in the system. Identity information includes stuff like your given name, surname, email address, your affiliations, and other stuff that's sort of related directly to a person. It also includes some identifiers that are tied to a particular entity or a person. Such things as a targeted ID, a principal name, the ORCID ID. These are just identifiers that are associated with a person or an entity or a principal and they, as part of their identity information. Other information that may be provided or collected about that makes up identity information is information that is about the organisation that a person is affiliated with. Things like their organisation name, their organisation type, the domain name that's tied to the organisation. So that can all be bundled up, part of the identity information that's provided from an IDP. The federation, your federation should define a set of attributes about or identity information that IDPs should collect. And this will ease the effort of your service providers to work effectively in your federation. It's a good idea to make your list of attributes that you want to collect or have your IDPs collect part of your rules. Within the federation that we run, the AAF, we have a template, an appendix to our rules, which just lists all of the attributes that we expect our IDPs to be able to collect and to provide to service providers. This doesn't mean that service providers get all of these attributes. The service provider must justify why they need attributes, and will generally get a subset of the attributes that are collected by IDPs, and not all of them. There's only a very few use cases where a service will require all of a person's identity information. Just another term here, the term attributes, which I've already used, is often used in place of identity information. It's just a bunch of information, or the details that are provided about a person or an entity or a thing that's logging into a service provided by the identity provider. Next, we move on to the principal. A principal, in computer security terms, is just an entity that can be authenticated by a computer system or network. So in our context here, this is generally the people who are authenticating to the services within the Federation. These people could be individuals, computers, services, computational entities such as processes and threads, or any group of such things. But in general, for our identity federations that we're talking about today, it's the people within the organizations who are principals that are using the services of the Federation. And these principals will have attributes, as we just discussed. They'll have email addresses, they'll have given names, surnames, identifying information, and they'll also have organizational information tied to them. Our relying parties. The relying party is a term used to refer to service providers, to a service providing access to a service. Start again. A relying party is a term used to refer to a server providing access to secure software applications. So in general, relying parties are just services in the Federation that users are attempting to access, where access requires them to authenticate to gain that access. In our federated model, the relying party offloads the authentication part to an IDP, but in general, the authorization, so I need to change that to an authentication service, such as an IDP. It can, however, restrict access to services based on local authorization decisions. So authentication is offloaded to the IDP, authorization is done at the service, because it's the service that knows who should be accessing what part of the service. That's a general model. Sometimes people do it other ways around, but it's basically the service gets the attributes about a person, and then it can make a decision if the person's authorized to access that particular service. The service provider doesn't need to worry about the username or the password. That's dealt with by the identity provider. They just need to get attributes and decide if the person's allowed to access the content that it's providing. The authentication service. This is the main function of the identity provider. The identity provider operates within an organization's domain. It receives requests to verify users' credentials, returning a response to the relying party or the service provider. The web form the service provider redirects the user to, web form the service provider redirects to allow the user to log in. So the service provider redirects to an identity provider web form where the user will log in. That web form lives within the organization's domain. The IDP may also pass some identity information about the user back to the service provider after the authentication has been completed. And on the right-hand side of the page, you can see some sort of interactions between service providers, user agents or people, and the identity providers. It just shows that the whole process is a bit complex. So it's something you don't really want to implement yourself. It's something that there are plenty of implementations to actually do this work for you. At the end of the day, the identity provider does the authentication with the user's credentials, gathers up some attributes and passes them back to the service provider, who then makes a decision on if the user is entitled to use the service or not. So, who has an IDP, or which organizations have IDPs? So not every organization in your federation will run an IDP. But organisations generally who have users who want to access services, and that organisation is entitled to be a subscriber of your federation. And here you'll need to decide if the organisation is entitled, and your federation rules should have some sort of definition about which type of organisations are entitled to use your services. For the Australian Access Federation, we allow universities in, and we expect them to have different types of users, such as researchers, students, academics, some professional staff, alumni, and also visitors to the organisation, such as visiting professors. They're all part of the university community, and we're quite happy to allow any of that community to participate in the federation. We also allow research institutions. In Australia, our big research institution is the CSIRO. They're across all of the states of Australia, and they have thousands of staff, and we're quite happy to allow them to use the federation to access the research type services that are in the federation. We also target government departments, health departments, science departments, education departments within our governments, targeting our researchers in those departments to allow them to collaborate with researchers in research institutions and universities throughout Australia and internationally. Also, sometimes professional staff might be sort of captured up in that government department type group of users. The other group or organisation that will tend to run an identity provider is the federation operator itself, the NREN, if it's going to be the NREN running the federation. The NREN or the federation operator will have a number of staff, and they'll need access to the federation, so it makes sense to provide an identity provider for those guys. But a number of federations also run an identity provider to allow access for people who don't have or are not part of an organisation that is in the federation. And this can be for commercial operators who have researchers. This can be for universities who are still yet to join the federation but have researchers who are keen to get started. It's got a name, a virtual home, virtual organisation. There are plenty of names for it, but it's basically an identity provider operated by the NREN where visitors can be added to that IDP to allow them to gain access to the services in the federation. This IDP can also be used to cater for another class of user, and that's the service provider who generally don't run an IDP but may require an admin account or some test accounts to actually test their service in the federation. The virtual home IDP is a fairly good place to give them accounts so they can actually get their service up and running and tested in your federation before they let it loose on your community of users. So that's who can run a federation, who can run a IDP within your federation. But who actually runs the IDP? So an IDP can be run in-house, or it can be run by a third party on behalf of an organisation. And there's a big move for organisations to outsource their software assets to third parties. We've seen that a lot in Australia, and we've actually got a service that we allow our subscribers to use to basically run their IDP for them. But the organisation still has a responsibility for their users if independent of where the IDP is run. They need to verify their identity, they need to provide them with some credentials, so issuing of credentials and maintaining those credentials. They also need to maintain the user's information, their names, their email address, basically maintain their attributes, and look after the user lifecycle. So as users come and go into and out of the organisation, their status will change. Their ability to log in will also change. So the IDP uses an identity store which is maintained by the organisation. So the identity store is just a directory or a database. It can even be a flat file for a very small organisation if they so choose. This identity store just holds the information and the credentials for the user. It's usually operated by the organisation, and the IDP plugs into that identity store. The organisation will also run some identity management software or identity management systems, which will deal with the user lifecycle and with maintaining the user's information within that identity store. So the identity provider sort of layers on top, the identity provider layers on top of the identity store and provides a mechanism for service providers to log in using the credentials stored within that identity store. Where the identity provider sits, it doesn't really matter. It can sit within the organisation. If the organisation has the ability and the skills and the people and the knowledge to run the identity provider, or as I said, they can outsource that to other providers. Generally, a federation operator will run some sort of, or may run a hosted IDP solution, or there are some commercial offerings out there. We'll have a look at those a bit later on in this presentation. So that's just a little bit about background about what an identity provider is. There are some requirements for running an identity provider that the organisations that run these things need to meet. And we'll just sort of skip through these in the next section. Firstly, the federation rules will impact which organisations can actually join your federation and therefore which organisations can run an identity provider. So for the AAF, our rules, and I've just cut this particular section out of our rules, for a subscription to the federation is available to organisations and institutes which undertake or support education, research, or research and development in Australia. So that sort of gives you a fairly high-level view of the types of organisations that can participate in the AAF. And under that, there's some dot points which sort of give you a bit more detail. So it can be any tertiary education institute, such as a university or a vocational education institution. It can be a government or commercial research institution and not-for-profit entities. It can be government or commercial product and service organisations delivering products and services. That third category, 4.1.2, generally don't run IDPs, but they'll want to use the virtual home or our virtual IDP so they can have some test accounts and some admin accounts to manage their services in the federation. The final point there is a bit of an out for any other organisation. If they want to join but don't meet the criteria above, they can come and ask us for an executive decision from our executive committee to decide if they're worthy or entitled to participate in the federation. I expect your federations will need to develop similar rules for who can participate in your federation, and we'll be discussing some of these rules and policy details at the APAN conference in New Zealand in a few months' time. This is where it gets sort of really interesting. The technical parts, once it's done, it's pretty boring. It's federation rules and federation policies that are the fun parts to get approval from everyone to participate. The next requirement is that an organisation has to have users that need to authenticate. So as I said, we've got researchers, students, academics, professional staff, alumni, visitors, etc., all different classes of users who would benefit from the services that are available in the federation. So who benefits most from the federation will depend on the types of services that are available in your federation. Our federation, AAF, which is our federation, has a focus on providing access to research tools and research services across Australia. So our main goal is to provide authentication services for research type tools and research services to support research effectively across Australia. Other federations have got a different focus. Some provide simpler access to publisher and journals type content. It depends on where you want to start and what's the goal of the federation. Providing simpler access to publishers may make it cheaper or easier for your universities to get access to some of these journals. The other reason to build a federation is to plug it into Edugain to get access to all of the services that are available in Edugain fairly quickly. So making the services and the the federation a valuable tool from the start. So you need to ask the question, what will be the focus of your federation initially when you start and as you grow into the future with your federation? The next requirement is that your users can authenticate against something. So you need to provide your users with some credentials, something that the user has that is used to authenticate them as a member of your organization. Initially, most will just provide some sort of username and password. They might provide physical tokens. They may even go to using biometrics or some combination of those three things, depending on the type of user. You might have your super users have both username and password and a physical token. And that's where we're talking about multi-factor authentication. There's a bit of work happening around other federations in bringing multi-factor authentication to their federation. I think some have already done a fair bit of work in this space. The credential is issued to the user when they join the organization and revoked when they no longer have an association with that organization. So that may be many, many years after they actually stopped studying or working for the organization. They may still have an alumni type relationship, so they may still have a need to have an active credential in your organizations. It depends on the policies and requirements of each of the organizations if they allow, or when they determine a user no longer has that association with the organization. The organization will need to have some processes that exist to determine the identity or verify the identity of users prior to issuing them their credentials. It's no use just giving out credentials to any Joe Blogs. The university or organization really needs to verify the identity of its users as they join the organization. And that's a process that the organisation will need to take on board. It may be showing a driver's licence, it may be going through some sort of school to university process, which happens in Australia. There may be other ways that identity is verified. There's also processes required by the organisation to manage the credentials and the user's attributes when they change. Again, there's processes and policies that organisations will deploy about how long a credential is valid. It may be 60 days, it may be 12 months, it may be forever. Depends on the policies and procedures at the organisation. Users will also change over time. Their names may change when they get married, divorced, or so forth. They may change their email addresses. Other things may change about the users, which will require the university or the organisation to update its attributes or the information it holds about the user. So it can make sure that the information published about the user through the federation is always current and correct. Beyond that, an organisation needs some sort of identity store to hold all this information, to hold the user's credentials together. The system must implement the processes to add, maintain and delete user information. It usually needs some sort of source of truth, so a student system or a HR system will feed into your identity store. And the identity store can be an LDAP directory. There's plenty of flavors of those. Microsoft Active Directory, or your Open LDAP, Apache Directory Server. The list goes on and on. You can search for evidence to find millions of different types of LDAP directories. Or it can be a database. It doesn't really matter. It just needs to be some sort of store which the IDP can query and use to verify a user's password or credentials. The store must be secure, however, if it's storing the user's passwords, and you should never store the user's passwords in clear text or use a reversible hash for the passwords. If those things are done, if those things aren't done, then it's very possible that users' credentials will be stolen and used incorrectly. So there needs to be some sort of security built around your identity store. Next is the layer on top of your identity store, is some identity provider software. It's a server or a cluster of servers that run the identity provider software that's chosen by the organization, which the user then, uses the identity store to verify users and to gather the attributes about the users to send off to the service that the user's trying to log into. The final thing is the identity provider needs to then be registered into the federation. The identity provider will have some metadata that describes the various aspects of the identity provider. This metadata needs to be shared across the federation. I'll be talking about why that's required shortly. Just go back one. Oh, I'll see that. Now I'll go back one. Now I've buggered it up completely. What happened there? Okay. That was interesting. Okay. Oops, it's not playing yet. Okay, so you can see there's a raft of things that your organizations will need to do to set up their identity provider. Setting up the actual software is the simple part. The underlying management and setting up of the identity processes that feed into the identity provider may be a challenge for some organizations. At the APAN conference in New Zealand, we have a lady, Heather, coming along to talk about these particular issues and try and provide some guidance on how to help your organizations work through these issues of getting the identity information into a state that it can be used for by the identity provider and thus the federation. So that should be an interesting talk because there's a lot of discussion about how this can be done in a fairly cost-effective and simple way, given it's not a very simple task to actually achieve. So next we're going to have a look at how does the IDP fit into the identity federation. So in our mesh federation, each organization operates its own IDP that is connected to its own local identity store, it's a directory or a database, and the IDP connects to an arbitrary number of service providers. So you can see the picture on the left is just a single IDP talking to many service providers. You take that into the federation and you get the picture on the right, which is all the identity providers talking to many services, some within the organization, some within other organizations, and some just spread out around from other from other service providers across the federation. So to make this work, the identity provider will have its own metadata. Each IDP has its own metadata and a unique identifier, it's entity ID, which is used to identify the entity within the federation. And my little example IDP has an entity ID which looks like that URL, https idp.exp.apan.net/idp/shibboleth, and that's just a string. It could be a URN which has got a different format. It's just a string which uniquely identifies the IDP across the whole of the federation. And the metadata, which I've got a snippet below on the left hand at the bottom, is just the technical information, the contact information, organizational information, and other useful information that's used across the federation. This information needs to be shared to all these service providers. So there's a two-way sharing that needs to happen in our mesh federation. For each entity to work within the mesh federation, its metadata needs to be shared between all of the entities. So all of the IDPs need to know about all of the service providers' metadata, and all of the service providers need to know about all of the IDPs' metadata. Now, mesh federation, this is achieved through the federation metadata files, generally just one big file which captures all of the federation entities. but with Jagga, there's several different versions of the metadata files, some specific to identity providers, which just holds all the service providers. And similarly, the specific service provider metadata, which just holds all the information about the IDPs. Generally, service providers don't need to know about other service providers, and IDPs don't need to know about other IDPs. They just need to know about the other, the service providers. And obviously, service providers need to know about identity providers. But Jagga also provides a version of the metadata which captures all IDPs and all service providers together. So for our pilot federation, we're using Jagga as a tool to curate this federation metadata, and it then used to create the federation metadata files, which are then published out to the service providers and IDPs. So just a quick review of Jagga, which we talked about 2 weeks ago. It's just a simple to install tool. It's open source, uses the MIT licensing model. It synchronizes SAML metadata from other federations. It creates and manages a federation or federations, creates and edits metadata for individual entities. It's got a notification subsystem with subscription options and much, much more. And we have an example Jagga, which is available for experimenting, and you can all play with it if you want at https://rr.aaftest.xyz/rr3, and we'll be having a look at that very soon. To log into Jagga, you require one of the following. You'll need a username or password to log in via a local account. Now these will be issued by the federation operator running Jagga. So if you have a new organization, they'll need to come to you and request a Jagga account to log in. Stop that. Sorry, the phone went off. So I require you to log into your IDP. Oh, yeah. So these are issued to federation operators running Jagga, and they're required until you have an IDP in your federation, so you can log in using your IDP. If you have an IDP in your federation and it's hooked up to the Jagga system, you can use that to authenticate, but you'll still require the federation operator to set the initial authorization level for you in the Jagga tool. So with the test demo Jagga, there's a guest admin account, and it's got a very simple password of password123, which is available for you to use in the APAN example Jagga service. So you can go and play with that until your heart's content. But you can't, no, the issue with this particular tool is you can't register anything until you have logged in. There are other tool sets around which allow you to register a new service or a new IDP without logging in, but it won't actually be activated until it's been approved. This then avoids the need to have a local account, because if you register your IDP, it gets approved and it works, then you can actually use your IDP to log in subsequently. So to register your IDP in Jagga, you'll need the following. You'll need the metadata for your IDP. You'll need information about your organization for who the IDP is being registered. You'll need some contact information, so who's your support contact, your administrative contact, technical, billing, security, other types of contacts. We're recommending that for contact email addresses, that you use group or positional email addresses and not personal email addresses. Positional email addresses don't have the issue of privacy, and they tend to stick around longer than personal email addresses. If a person moves out of an organization, then the positional email address will be filled by the next person who takes on that position, assuming their identity management system's working properly. There's some user interface information that's used by the Federation, so some organization details, some policy details, and some localization or local location information. So once you're once you register your IDP, it will require approval by the Federation operator. So let's have a look at that. So this is already pre-logged into Jagga. This is what we've got so far. And we're going to register an identity provider. And it will look something like this. And you see that. So the first thing is you can optionally drop in some metadata from your service, from your IDP. And I will do that for an IDP that I've got. If I can just quickly jump in here. Scroll back to the start of that. So I've got an IDP sitting down here, and its initial metadata, which is probably not the right one to do, but we'll drop it in there anyway. Looks like this. There's plenty of it. You can see there's a warning at the top because this is the out-of-the-box metadata that's been generated by the Shibboleth IDP installer, and it recommends that you verify and check that this metadata is good before you load it in. So I'm just going to assume that it is. You'll probably lose that message now. Click that up a bit. We'll go next. And it's taken that metadata and started to build for me a entry in the Jagga registry for this IDP. It's identified some contact details for me. There's some tabs across the top here that we need to go and view before we can actually go and register this thing. It also gives me the option to add it to a federation. I can choose my APAN demonstration federation, or I can do that later on. For the moment, I'll do that a bit later. It'll ask me to fill in some organization information. This page is a bit tricky for new people who haven't done this before. I think Dahlia got caught out by this one. But if you want to add some details, you click the Add New Language button, which doesn't really make sense, but you can then add information about the organization name. So I'm just going to call this organization mine organization. I'm going to give it the same display name. I'm going to give it a URL. Oops. Then I move on to the next tab, which is some contacts. I can add some contact information. I've got different types of contacts I can add, and the more contacts, the better. One thing that we do find difficult just in the Australian Access Federation is keeping this contact information up to date. That's why we recommend that people use their positional or group-based email addresses. They tend to change less frequently, and the people who are in those groups or those positions, it becomes the organisation's problem to maintain this information. But for now, I'm just going to stick my name in and use my real email address. And I can add a second one. I can add a technical contact, Dahlia, Abraham. And just to be complete, I'll add so there's a number of contacts. We've got some user information, got UI information. Again, this just for fun, some keywords. I shouldn't put dots, I should just put that. URL information, a bunch of stuff. Not all of this is required, so I could skip some of that. Some hints, which this is specific to discovery services. It allows the discovery service to try and guess the best IDP to present to a service provider, or sorry, to a user when they try and choose which organization that they belong to when they go through discovery, and we'll talk about that in about a month's time. Then we've got the SAML stuff. This is all the technical information. This has been all pulled out of that metadata that I provided earlier. It goes on and on. This is where you can read your SAML spec to find out what this stuff all means. And then certificates. Again, this is pulled out of the metadata that I provided earlier, where you can add this by hand if you want to. So I think we're ready to go. So you scroll down again to the bottom. All this stuff somewhere at the bottom. Then we've got a register button. We'll click to register. Sorry?
Already exist.
Oh, bugger. Thought I deleted that one. Okay, so let's go to SAML and make this. Change that. Okay, so now it's ready to approve. As the federation operator, I get this little flag up here, and it tells me that me has requested an IDP, primary contact. Click on the arrow, and it gives me all the details. You can see I made that change there just so I can get in. We'll need to clean that up later. We can look at all the details. I should look at that in much more detail than I've just scanned through, but I'm just going to accept that. And now we'll see that my identity provider has been registered. And there it is. And it's sitting there, but it's all sitting there by itself. It needs to be added to a federation. So the next thing we can do as a federation operator, I can look at the membership, and I can directly add, or I can invite an identity provider to join my federation. For now, I'm just going to add that IDP. It just gives me the list of all that are available. Now for this, I've actually just sucked in all of the AAF's IDPs previously. Where are we? That's the one there that we want to add. Click the little button. Go add. It tells me the new member has been added to the federation. Let's go and have a look. Federation. It tells me I've got one now identity provider in my federation. Yay. I can have a look at the contact lists for that. Just downloaded that to a little file, which is a text file. So it just provides me with the list of email addresses of the people who are contacts for that federation, which is basically the 3 people I added when I registered the thing. I can have a look at the membership, and it shows I've got one identity provider. It's got Terry's organisation. It's got my identity provider in there. Then I can have a look at the metadata. As I said earlier, there's different flavours. There's the full metadata, which covers all the pieces. There's the federation metadata for your identity providers only, which will cover all of the service providers. The federation for the service providers only. And this one should have in it the metadata for that service I just registered. If you have a look at that, probably can't see that. What have we got here? Nope. But it will have the metadata for the IDP that I've just registered. So feel free to use the system and play around with it. If you haven't got your own, or if you've got your own, go and have a play in that and just sort of work your way through all the buttons, all the options that are available. The next webinar in 2 weeks' time, we'll actually add a service to the federation and show how that service and that identity provider can work together by sharing their metadata. So in Jagga, you can register multiple federations. You can also register IDP and 0 or more of these federations. We've only got one federation, as I've shown, the APAN Demonstration Federation. Oops. And you can select that federation to join when initially registering from the drop-down list, or you can be added or invited to join from the federation owner. A member of the federation, once your IDP is a member of the federation, its metadata will appear in the federation's metadata and thus can be consumed by all service providers in the federation. Your IDP now needs to be configured to consume the federation metadata so it can see all the metadata of all the services in that federation. Now, once that's all done, your IDP is part of the federation, and your users can now log in to services that are part of the federation using your IDP. But this is another step that the IDP, the service providers need to take, and we'll look at that next time. So the final section is about the available software options that you have for running your IDP, and there are plenty of these. We'll just sort of skip through these, but I will put together a bit of a table of some useful resources that you can use to help you set up your software. I'd recommend picking one as the sort of core one that your federation will support. In the AAF at the moment it's Shibboleth, and get some people trained up on how to install and configure Shibboleth or whatever you choose, and then run some training activities with your organizations about setting up this identity provider. If they're ready to have an identity provider, which means have they got an identity store which can sit underneath their identity provider. If they haven't got an identity store, then you need to actually go back and work with them to get that identity store happening. There is the other approach you can take and just have it outsourced to some third party, and we'll have a look at some of those as well. So the options are, there's a couple of open source offerings. There's probably more than these two, but these are the two most popular ones. There's Shibboleth and SimpleSAMLphp. So Shibboleth, it's currently at version 3. It's used by a majority of organizations participating in identity federations. It's super highly configurable, and there's some it's got ongoing development, and it's supported by the Shibboleth Consortium, which is then supported further by many of the federations across the globe. There are many guides and options available to assist with setting up and configuring the Shibboleth IDP. Some of these guides will walk you through the process, while others will provide scripted or pre-built Docker type setups that need some minimal effort to get it up and running. Running your own will always require some effort, as is the case with running any software. So even once you've got it set up, there's an ongoing cost and effort to keep it maintained and at the current version, at the current release version. So it's always a moving target with software. There's a number of shibboleth software as a service options. The UK Federation have a service called Liberate, which is a shibboleth in a box type service, and they're marketing that globally. In Australia, we have a thing called Rapid IDP, which is a new service, and that's a shibboleth, a highly available shibboleth service. At the moment, it's only available to Australian ID organisations, but we are looking at making it available wider, in the first instance to New Zealand organisations, but it may go beyond that. Open Athens also have an option. I'm not sure if it's shibboleth based, but they do have an option for running an IDP on behalf of an organisation. And there are a number of commercial offerings that will set up and run a hosted shibboleth service for you. You can use your organisation. It can use either your organisation's identity store if you have one, or it can provide their own local store for smaller organisations. So it runs its own local identity store. There is still need to set up and maintain the users within those identity stores, and that's still the function of the organisation based on its policies and procedures. But the main benefit of using software as a service is that it offloads the setup and maintenance activities of running your IDP. If you've got a good software as a service provider, then they will also always make sure that your software is up to date and always running. Next is SimpleSAMLphp as an IDP. So it's an alternative offering that's used by many European-based organisations. It's wholly written in PHP. It's again highly configurable, and this piece of software can actually operate as both an IDP and a service provider. It's got also ongoing development, which is being led by Uninet. It also supports other identity protocols and frameworks. It's not just a SAML IDP, it can be used for other protocols. It's got a strong user community, and it's a little bit simpler to set up and configure than shibboleth. So it's much of a muchness, which way you want to go with those two. The commercial offerings, and this list grows and grows and grows. At the top of the list, we've got Microsoft Active Directory Federation Services, and there's a big push to the cloud for this particular offering for Microsoft Azure Active Directory Premium. Ping Federate, Okta, NetIQ, the list goes on and on. But we'll have a quick look at Active Directory Federation Services because it's got some airplay both locally in Australia and globally, what they're doing. So many organisations are using Active Directory Federation Services and are moving slowly towards AADP, Active Directory Azure Active Directory Professional, to provide their enterprise level access management. Both of these offerings support SAML 2, but both generally are not really identity federation ready yet. They can do a good job at the enterprise level, but tend to fail at the federation level. There's some work going on ongoing to improve how ADFS and ADP can operate in a federation, and that's happening in a couple of federations overseas. Most notably, some work's happening out of the Canadian Federation, and there's another federation working with them, but I'm not sure who that is. There's also work underway to improve the user experience for organisations that operate both ADFS and shibboleth. Here, instead of having two different login pages, the aim is to stack ADFS on top of shibboleth. So shibboleth uses ADFS as login page to log in. So the user experience is one of a single login page and not being confused by having multiple login pages. And that's some work that we're actually undertaking with within Australia to have a look at that particular option. I've only got the one reference today. I need to extend this references because there's a bunch of stuff that needs to be referenced in the table of tools and guides that are available for setting up Shibboleth and SimpleSAMLphp, which I'll make available to you beyond this webinar. So that's the brief introduction to identity providers. We didn't really go into installing or setting up an identity provider. That's a much more detailed task. I'm happy to do that sort of a webinar thing for Shibboleth at some point after APAN 46, if it's required or if it's wanted. But it's something you should consider doing for your local organisations, running sort of workshops and working with your folk to get them up to speed on Shibboleth. The next session in 2 weeks' time is on service providers. So we'll just go through a similar sort of process of talking about what a service provider is, how it fits into an identity federation, and we'll actually get an identity federation working with a service provider and an identity provider and using Jagga in the middle to sort of distribute the metadata between the two. And beyond that, the discovery services and metadata discussion about setting up those things, a federated discovery service and a central metadata distribution point. And then we'll see you all in APAN 46 in New Zealand in August. Where is that not going anywhere? And the next slide should say questions. So I'm going to just open up the chat. So if any questions, Brooks put some comments in here. So it's Swamid from Sweden and Canary from Canada that's working on the ADFS toolkit. And I hope to be having a conversation with the guys from those federations in the next few weeks to discuss what they're actually trying to achieve with the toolkit. There was recently the TNC conference last week, which Brooke attended and some other folk from my federation attended. And there are some presentations from TNC that talk about the ADFS toolkit. It's a fairly short presentation, but it'll give you a bit of an idea of what's happening in that space. Okay, we've got a question from Mohammed about how do you test the IDP without any service providers configured. There are some tools that are available that come with the IDP. There's the AAL, depending on what type of the Shibboleth IDP, there's the AACLI, which is the Attribute Authority Command Line Interface, which will allow you to test to see if the attributes are being provided back from the IDP using a command line tool. I'll provide you a reference to that in the next few days about how to set that up. But it's difficult to test without actually having a service provider configured. But setting up a service provider is much easier than setting up an IDP for the Shibboleth stuff. Brooks also put an entry into the EduGain.org Slack if you want to sign up for real-time chats to talk with folk. So there's a Slack channel that we'll be using.
Yeah, just also to say we're going to be looking for mentors out of the wider Federation community to support individual offerings, because not everything can be done by Terry alone. So for those that are already participating within TFIAM and also the wider community. So knowing more information about your own region setup, like whether your campuses are using ADFS, whether they're Active Directory shops, whether they use Open LDAP, whether they use, library management systems of particular types, and how you deploy software, whether you do it all manually or whether you use, Chef or Puppet, CF Engine or Ansible or Salt or Docker or some virtual machine tooling. all of that is useful information. So I'll be reaching out to people to get some more background information on your setup, to try and find mentors to work with you if you're interested in that.
Okay, so it's 4:05. Do we start 3:05?
Yep.
So I did use up the whole hour. I'll try and be quicker next time, but there's a lot to cover in this space. If you have any further questions, please shoot them to either to the Slack group or to TFIAM group, the email group. We want to get that group up and firing and being used more productively. And I'll be publishing this webinar together with the previous one on YouTube in the near future. So if there are no more questions, thanks for coming along today. We'll record your attendance in our little check-off book for the Backfire project, and hopefully see you in a fortnight's time, and we'll actually have hopefully an IDP talking to a service provider in a very small federation. Okay, thanks everyone. And I'm going to now stop the video thing, stop recording.